Welcome to Authors at Drucker. I'm Dave Specht, Director of the Global Family Business Institute at the Drucker School of Management. At the Drucker School, we aspire to become the global meeting place for the world's most influential business-owning families. This conversation today represents great progress in our achievement of that objective. Authors at Drucker is an interview series where we feature top authors that write about issues impacting business-owning families. Authors at Drucker is made possible from the generous sponsorship from the Jay Hughes Jr. Foundation and also from the Gamble family. Thank you both so much. The foundation is dedicated to advancing the study of family governance and generational well-being. We at the Drucker School feel very aligned and very grateful to Jay Hughes and his foundation and the Gamble family. Last month, we featured the book Karen Dillon wrote with the late Clayton Christensen, How Will You Measure Your Life? If you missed it, I would really encourage you to go back and see that. That's one of the fantastic books. Very introspective, and it'll make you think about how you're spending your time and your energy. Couple things here before we get started. I'm going to share my screen briefly. We'll get to the star of the show in just a minute. Next month, we will have Bernie Jaworski, the Drucker professor, talking about his new book, Creating the Organization of the Future. And that one's going to be very interesting. It's building off of the work of Drucker and Confucius and looking at kind of the intersection of some of their thinking. We also, Jay and I, collaborated on a generational wealth masterclass. If you're interested in learning more about that, as we launch that, please do send me an email. And that's just at david.specht@cgu.edu. And finally, we're also very excited to announce that we've launched the Certificate in Advising Family Enterprises, and this is for banks, accounting firms, and advisors to family enterprises that want to get better at the intersection of the financial and non-financial lives that these wonderful business-owning families are living. So with that, we will get to the star of the show. So today's guest at Authors at Drucker is a longtime friend and mentor. He's the author of multiple books that have had significant impact on the way that we all think about governance and well-being when it comes to the definition of wealth. Jay Hughes is a retired attorney and a generous thought leader in the field of family wealth, and perhaps that's the main reason that you guys are here today, because of his generosity towards you. Jay has given so much to the field, and Jay, thanks for joining me today.
Well, this is a real gift to me to see so many friends and the audience. I'm humbled, Dave, by the faces and the memories. Some of the faces go back 40 years that are on today. So I'm really humbled, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we could cover a lot of things, Jay, but we're going to try to stick to the cycle of the gift today, and some of the teachings and some of the stories that have come from the development of that material, but also the application of that material that comes through that book. So, Jay, we'll start with a broad question, and then we'll get more granular. But generally speaking, why are gifts so challenging for both the giver and the receiver?
Well, I think the right place to start, Dave, this morning is with Aristotle's admonition. And please, those of you, I'm not just quoting an old expert, no. Aristotle, when he was writing about virtue, which we don't discuss much anymore, but virtues are the immutable things: courage, justice, empathy, interconnectedness. Aristotle said that to make a gift well is a virtue. It rises to that level. And what he said was that a real gift reaches the word magnificence. And anything less is a transfer. So when we think about what it means to make a gift, the question we have to ask is, are we acting magnificently? So I'm starting there because I want this to be an aspirational conversation. As you know, I love aspiration. I don't think you can get to inspired if you don't first aspire. And then, Dave, as you and I know, then you have to perspire. So all gifts, if they're going to be magnificent, have to meet, I think, aspiration. They have to have a spirit that's integral to them.
So Jay, you've seen a lot of transfers in your career, and you've seen some gifts. How do you differentiate? I mean, and is it, do you find out early that it's a transfer, or is it later that you find out it was actually a transfer and not a gift? Take us through that.
Well, again, I'm going to quote a great personality whose name was Maimonides. And Maimonides was a Jewish rabbi in Spain in the 13th century. And he sat down one day to write the levels of giving. Now, Dave, to understand a transfer, Maimonides said the lowest form of gift, and that's a transfer, is to give grudgingly and less than you can afford. That's a transfer.
Mm.
Transfers have, as one of my great friends said, lots of strings attached with anchors into the ground that you have to pull up to sort of get the transfer. They're not, I don't think these are magnificent acts. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would agree.
So transfers are not necessarily good for your health. They're not bad. Maimonides gave us actually 7 levels of giving. But that grudging and less is very often a definition of a transfer. Well, I guess I just have to do it, but I really don't want to do it. So, oh dear, isn't the word grudging 2 G's in a word? Oh, not a good word. Okay, over to you.
So let's get personal for a second, because I'm certain that there have been gifts that you've received in your life, and there have been transfers probably in your life as well. Do you have any memories of a gift that you've received that really made an influence on your life or an impact on your life, Jay? This one wasn't in the script, so I'm throwing Jay a little bit of curveball, but I want him to pull us behind the curtain into his personal life.
Well, as many of you know, as a Buddhist, but basically a Calvinist, talking about myself is the worst possible thing to be asked to do. Oh dear. But I'll do my best, okay? In the 8th grade graduation from a tiny school in Short Hills, New Jersey, called the Farbrook School, where in my books, for people that are interested, they'll see that when I sort of cite myself, I mention that I went to Princeton and to Columbia, but I just say I went there. I always say that I was educated at the Farbrook School those first 8 years, and that's true. Very irregularly, the Farbrook School graduation of the 8th grade, which is the highest level of that school, gave the Citizenship Award, very unusually. And so I'm sitting in the audience, and the headmistress says, Jay, you have to come forward. Terrible. And I'm presented with the Citizenship Award. Dave, that's perhaps the most important gift I was ever given. And I cherish the little scroll that on which this sits, because I think I must have done something for the school and for my classmates that represented citizenship.
Well, you got vulnerable with me, so I'll get vulnerable for a second with you. One of the great gifts that I've ever received, Jay, is actually from you, and it was your time. And in the creation of this interview series, this Generational Wealth Masterclass, you didn't know how it was going to turn out. You had faith in me that we could make something, and a gift of time. As I think about, my 6 kids, time is probably the greatest gift that I can give to them, and a thoughtful use of that time together. So, anyways, I want the audience to get creative, and as they think about gift giving and that they receive. So can we turn to the receiver for a second, Jay? So being a good gift giver, has its own unique challenges. You have to be awake, first of all, to the receiver and what would be a magnificent gift for them to receive. And I find myself not always being a great gift giver because I sometimes give my kids the things that I would have wanted when I was their age.
Right.
Shame on me, but I'm working on it. But tell us a little bit about the dynamics of being a good receiver. What goes into that?
Well, first of all, a real gift, as opposed to a transfer, comes from outer space like a meteor, and it has inside it spirit. It has that aspirational and inspirational nature of the giver. The recipient is always surprised. That's a gift. So if you think for a moment, as some people like to make pictures, if you think of it leaving the hand of the giver with spirit inside that meteor, the meteor for a moment is itself. It just stands alone. And then it comes into the integrity and atmosphere of another human being. And always as a surprise. Once the surprise is accepted, there is an awareness on the recipient's part. One, am I worthy? That's a very, very important question. And two, how shall I integrate this? Because it's unexpected. Integration is a very complicated thing. So many, many times, Dave, in my, hundreds and hundreds of times, I've seen people make gifts that the recipient could not integrate. So this is the core question. We don't look at the recipient properly when we actually make the gift. We often act spontaneously, which is good. I'm in favor of spontaneity. But I'm also even more in favor of asking, how will this person integrate that which I am sending to him or her? Because it's a meteor from outer space for them.
Jay, can you give us a concrete example of when someone maybe wasn't able to integrate it, just so that it's really tangible?
Well, let's look at it. Let me back up a little bit here and then offer a very specific answer. Lots and lots of actions that are called gifts, that are really transfers, have some element of obligation on the part of the recipient, some duty expected of the recipient, and very often have something to do with some level of support. One of my definitions for Aristotle's magnificence and for the recipient is, will this enhance this person's life? I don't think support activities are gifts. I think they're transfers. They're necessary. So will this enhance his or her life? Is a good measure, I think, of how it might be received. The problem is that very often in our world, in the world of the 117 of us that are on today, the gifts are too big, Dave. I could give you lots of examples, but I think where I'm going to stay in high up, and I will give you one practical example, but the gifts are too big. The stage of life of the person that's going to integrate it isn't there yet for the size of the gift they're being asked to deal with. Mm-hmm. So measuring what is life enhancing, what will actually change positively the experience of a human being at that stage of life, frankly, is often not considered. The other thing, of course, is if you're living in a dynastic family and you're the third or fourth generation of some extraordinary wealth creator and generator, and you're going along with your life, just being a normal person, and then you get the great reveal. So what I'm going to do, Dave, rather than give you a specific example, is say that every great reveal contains in it the possibility it's just too much. Not too much because it's just that's the way it is. That's the size of that trust. That's the size of that limited partnership interest. But just too much. And the person is saying, well, in my stage of life, what am I going to do? Now, I'll add one thing here. The most successful recipients of gifts, significant gifts, in my law practice and my personal practice have been those who said, Mr. Hughes, I'm not ready for this. Would you take care of it for me for a little while? I'll come back to you when I'm ready. Not the ones who said, oh, I have 10 things to spend the money on, or those who say, I got to give it away because it's so scary. Those are kind of post-traumatic stress responses to a meteor. But the ones that are really thoughtful were the ones who said, you know what, not right this minute. I have some things to do. You feeling this?
Yeah.
So that the spirit that goes into that meteor, think about the recipient. Who is he or she? What is their stage of life? What would enhance their lives? And then if you can't do anything about the great reveal, because some future past generation set it up that way, be incredibly empathetic to that little person.
Yeah.
Who may even be carrying a name that he or she can't really fully yet hold on to. It's a big name.
Yeah.
So empathy is the key to the intermediation of the integration.
To me, it all begins with what is catalyzing that gift. And too often the catalyst of a gift is a tax planning strategy or an estate planning strategy that then causes us to have a conversation about a transfer. And if it begins with those things, it typically ends as a transfer and not as a gift. It takes a lot of work and a lot of foresight to make a gift.
Yep.
And I hope that we're not I hope that's not understated. It is hard to make a gift.
No.
And so we have a great deal of empathy for all of you that are listening. And when you feel like, well, I've made a lot of transfers in my life and not a lot of gifts. We all have, but the purpose of us thinking and being critical in this way of how we think about gifts and transfers is an opportunity for the next one to be a great gift. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay. Now I'm going to give an answer to your question about a transfer rather than a gift. So I want everyone who's listening to imagine the following conversation. So it's the year 2021. It's December the 4th. And Accountant Jones calls Mrs. Smith. And he says, hi, Mrs. Smith. Oh, Accountant Jones. Lovely to hear from you. How are your family? Oh, they're fine. Thank you. Mrs. Smith, have you written the checks? Oh, Accountant Jones, I haven't written the checks. Well, I think you will, and I'm sure your son will come by to pick them up for Christmas morning. Okay, fine. She gets her checkbook out. She writes the 20 checks for all the different family members that'll be there that morning. And Bob comes by. Mom, great to see you. December the 20th. Oh, Mom, thank you. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now it's December the 5th, 2022, a year later. This is Accountant Jones. Hi, Mrs. Smith. Oh, Accountant Jones. How are you? Lovely to hear. How are your family? Oh, it's fine. Mrs. Smith, have you written the checks? Oh, she says, Attorney, I'm so sorry. I'll get right to it. So she gets her checkbook out and she begins to write the check to Bob. She said, oh my goodness, I haven't heard from Bob in 6 months. And I don't remember any thank you note for those last 5 years. So she she says, now I got to write the check to Sally. Well, I haven't heard from Sally either. So now Bob comes on the 20th of December and Mom says, nice to see you. And Christmas morning comes and everybody's all ready. And he says, Mom's gone crazy. No checks.
She forgot.
That's a transfer.
That's a transfer. That's a transfer.
That's a transfer, right? Okay.
Yes. So what can we do with those? Because there's a lot of that happens, these annual gifts that are at the end of the year. I mean, I have some ideas of how to somewhat, bring some meaning to those, but whether it's a note or a conversation, Jay, what have you seen?
Well, first of all, a check in an envelope is meaningless. That's the grudging and less than, even if it's what you can afford. There's no gift there. That's an obligation. And by the way, it'd be received by the person as an obligation. Oh, my grandmother's rich. She gives me a check for Christmas. There's not any gift in that at all. There's no spirit in it. There's no aspiration for the person. There's no inspired act. It's just a routine matter.
Yeah.
Routine matters create inertia in relationships. Inertia is deadly. Remember, inertia is the force in physics you die from cold. At least fission, it's hot. There's some energy there. But the problem of inertia is there's just cold.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would say is there must be a note with that check and advising the recipient that they're loved.
Yeah.
That there is some, that they're proud. And so I'm proud of you. There's something personal.
Yeah.
And if the recipient can't send a text, I'm not asking anybody to pick up pen and pencil anymore. I'm believe it or not, even at 81, I'm conscious that I'm not getting pen and pencil anymore. But the text is fine. Grandpa, thank you for your check. And I'm going to do so-and-so with it. Now we have a gift. There's reciprocity in the right sense, not in a bad sense. And because reciprocity, Dave, and this is again a great gift, 1 + 1 makes 3. That's fusion. That's how our universe works positively, right?
Yes.
So if I'm thinking of you carefully and inspirited, put that check in and you get a meteor, you have to integrate it. And your integration back is, oh, thank you, love. And this is what I'm going to do. Now you have fusion. You don't have that horrible cold of Mrs. Smith saying, oh, I didn't hear from anybody.
Yeah. So Jay, we've talked about givers and receivers, and most of the gifts that we've been referring to have been monetary. They've been financial, but there are lots of types of gifts. One gift we can give to our families is, how we honor their names. A wise man once told me, Dave, if my kids don't inherit my values, my valuables will be of little benefit to them in their life. Jay, when it comes to passing on our values from one generation to the next, what are some activities or techniques that you've seen other families employ to not only pass on their valuables, but to transition and pass on their values?
Well, I think, Dave, that we could say probably without too much doubt that there's no family in the modern world that doesn't value education or learning. Learning is more than education. Certainly, we could say that any family that intends to have a long run has to be a learning family.
Mm-hmm.
Has to be bringing information, converting it to knowledge, maybe even wisdom, and sharing it. One of the things that's perplexing to me, and I don't know why it is, but one of the greatest opportunities for a family, for a young person to know they're loved, is to understand where their tuition comes from.
Mm.
By the way, it's also great budgeting for kids in college. Well, here's your tuition, and do you understand where it's coming from? How that money arose? Where it came? Who created this? Just as our listeners are thinking for a moment, those that are in dynastic families for the moment, no private school in America would exist without the grandparents paying the tuition. It wouldn't.
Yeah.
It would be impossible. So where's the money coming from? Well, part of the great reveal is it's too much. You were asking before, it's often just too much for the person. But everybody who's going to private school of some sort can learn where the tuition comes from. And it's a gift. You don't get to that school and have that tuition paid as an obligation. That's an incredible gift, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the possibilities for you by that choice of that learning, that educational institution, are someone's desire for you to have a great set of experiences. So, as a very, very basic tool, I say to the families that I help and to the advisors, give the children a chance to understand where the tuition came from, what it costs to go to that institution, why you chose it. And not only are they expected to get A's, that's not really valid. No, what do you expect them to get from that school that will be intrinsically important to them for the rest of their lives? That they can understand. And you've also given them the benefit of an adult conversation. Now, of course, appropriate to the age. And I'm not suggesting the 6-year-old needs to know about the $30,000 for his kindergarten. No, no, I'm not. But I do think the person rising to college who isn't included in the tuition conversation, this is missing an enormous opportunity for interchange.
Yeah.
Particularly if the grandparents, by the way, are paying. Because the parents act like they're paying, but they're not. And then the kid finds it out. And now what is the kid supposed to think? I'm dumb. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
I didn't thank the right person. Hey, look at all you see, that's a slippery slope. Enough said.
It is. It is. So yeah, I'm a big believer that the distance between the giver and the receiver, it makes it either an entitlement or a gift. The farther away the giver is from the receiver, it feels more and more like an entitlement. So I love the idea of sharing the story of where that's coming from and then having them know. Let's stay on the grandparent theme for a second here, Jay. Every grandparent I've ever met feels like it's okay for them to spoil their grandkids and then send them home. But let's talk about what is a healthy relationship between grandparent, grandchild, and where do the parents fit when it comes to this spoiling that happens to these grandchildren?
Well, when one is looking at long-term human relationships, one is always wise to see what the Chinese have to say about it. Remember, the Chinese are a 4,000-year-old culture, as Matt Wesley would say, and they have hundreds of proverbs. So when I get a question like that, I say, well, what do the Chinese know about this? Well, the Chinese have a proverb that says the grandparents and the grandchildren are the natural enemies of the parents.
Seems pretty harsh.
Now, here in the world of positive psychology, this has been changed to say the grandparents and the grandchildren are naturally allied. The Chinese got it right. Don't dumb it down. So if you parents think the kids are not going to get spoiled by the grandchildren, get over it. Get over it. They're going to be spoiled by the grandparents. The Chinese have 4,000 years of observation. We don't need a social anthropology course to learn this. Okay. Now, how do we make it work? Well, the parents would really prefer that the grandparents do something more substantive. So rather than surfeiting on Halloween candy, can we do something? So many of you know that years ago, and you can find this in the website of my foundation, I wrote a paper about grandparent-grandchild philanthropy. What was I trying to convey in that paper? And why do I keep doing this in my own family? And why do I advocate it all the time? Well, what do grandchildren want to know about their grandparents? Were they ever 10 years old? What do grandparents want to know from their grandchildren? Who are you? Philanthropy in grandchild, small amounts of money, in which the grandchild comes to a meeting with the other grandchildren, parents excluded. They can stand upstairs and listen, but they can't come to the meeting. The grandparents ask the children, what would you like to give to? That's appropriate in your age. And they have had to go out and find a philanthropy, talk to the director, come with a paper, business plan, present it to the grandparents and the grandchildren, and they get something. And then they have to go back to the philanthropy and present the check. That in and of itself is already making gifts, isn't it? The child is thoughtful. They go have a conversation or have an aspiration to help something. All of this is learning how to make a gift. What's in it for the grandparents? Well, not only that they can experience their grandchildren this way, but they will almost always tell stories. What are the best stories? Again, Dave, I cannot tell you how many captains of industry, huge personalities, who I've offered this idea to, say, well, my grandchildren don't want to know anything about me. I say, well, now wait a minute. And so what am I going to talk about? I say, well, were you ever 10 years old? What? I say, yeah, were you ever 10 years old? Well, yeah, I was 10 years old. Well, tell them what it was like to be 10 years old, because they're 10 years old. They don't need to know what you were like at 60. No, they want to know if you were ever a kid.
Yeah.
And so you tell stories. That's a huge gift. There's no transfers in this, right?
Absolutely.
This reaches Aristotle's test of magnificence, of course, because it's the human experience. I just can't tell the audience and you how often these captains of industry sit in the room with their grandchildren telling about going to some summer camp or what it was like to go to their grandparents' house and what the behavior was like, and that they had to wear a jacket and tie for dinner, and it was hot as hell. Excuse me. And they had to sit at the table for 2 hours, and they had no PDA, and they had to shut up. Oh, my goodness. Those old times must have been terrible.
Stories, gifts, stories absolutely are a gift. And I think another part of that story is knowing the stories of the struggle and the development of an enterprise.
Yes.
And I think even talking about, things that worried them, especially at that same age. I just had this experience, Jay, with my 15-year-old freshman son, and telling him a story about when I was a freshman and the things that I worried about. There was a kid I thought was going to beat me up, Jay.
Oh, yeah.
And I told him the story, and you know what? I think he saw me a little bit more as a peer, and like, God, wow, Dad, you experienced that too, huh? Well, yeah, the stories are really important.
Yeah, this is the richness of that interchange. And by the way, third parties get benefited.
Yeah.
Win.
Absolutely.
By the way, one other great thing that grandchildren also are interested in, particularly if they're in their teens and 20s, because I'm not just talking about little kids. Grandchildren grow up.
Yeah.
And people like me get to 81 and suddenly they have a 27-year-old grandchild who gets married. So the grandchildren are not just all 5 years old. One of the great questions for that group is, did you ever have a mentor? So again, you have a captain of industry or a male, female who had this tremendous life and everything looks successful. And you discover that they all had mentors, most of whom they've not yet really forgotten, but it isn't in the current story.
Yeah.
But when you go back to the story of their 20s, when they had a dream or an aspiration, I think it's the same thing. How did that get born? And you always find that they had an elder mentor.
Yeah,
Always.
absolutely. Yeah,
So,
there's a term that makes me a little bit crazy, and the term is self-made. Have you ever
not
heard of that,
true.
Jay?
Yeah, yeah,
Self-made millionaire.
yeah.
I'm a
Well,
self-made. Well, that is very short-sighted, and I think
and
it leads
if
to
Dave,
hubris.
if I can say something a little risque, they had two parents.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Self-made is probably not a proper biological reality.
It's true. It's true.
And
So
maybe
none of
they had
us,
grandparents too. Ah,
absolutely.
amazing.
So, anyways, none of us are self-made. Let's pivot now. I want to talk about trust because I feel like gifts that happen within a trust structure sometimes are seem to be the most fraught. Um, can you talk about why a trust structure sometimes why there's such a big struggle for something that ends up in a trust to actually feel like and become a gift? What is it about that structure that's challenging?
Well, trustees have, as all I think everyone on this call knows, three functions. They have to administer all tax, they have to invest prudently, and what they must never do is make a distribution. What they must know is that 60% of their time must be spent on life enhancement, because that's the reason the trust exists in the first place. Now, I'm going to say something possibly radical to people listening, but no trust of any kind ever written that doesn't have at the beginning of it in two sentences, either in print or intentionally, is that it's a gift of love and it exists to enhance the life of the beneficiary. Everything must start there because anything else is a transfer. If the trust itself isn't a gift of love and it isn't exist to enhance the life of the beneficiary, then we're already in trouble, aren't we, with Maimonides? We're heading down toward grudging. We're heading down to, well, I had to do it. I didn't have any choice. One of the awful places in law offices is when somebody says, the lawyer says, well, you have three choices. You can pay the taxes, or you give it to philanthropy, or I don't know what the third choice. That's a terrible conversation. Because now all that means is the plan is a transfer. There's nothing inspired in it.
Yeah.
Suppose instead the conversation about the trust is, well, are you interested in making a gift of love? Are you interested in enhancing the life of the beneficiary? Now, getting from philosophy down to practice, the question I ask trustees is, first of all, how are you spending your time? The answer I get is 20 to 30% on administration, 20 to 30%, maybe 40% on investment. I'm getting close to 80% on those two, leaving only a stub for life enhancement.
Yeah.
And I then ask that same trustee, okay, don't you outsource all the administration? Well, yes, that's true, I do. And then I ask, under the prudent investor rule, don't you outsource the investment? Oh, yes, I do. Oh, really? Well, how about spending 60% on the love and the enhancement? Oh, dear. Oh, well, that's hard work. Really? Why
They
are
didn't
you the
train me to
trustee?
they didn't train me to do that,
Why
Jay.
are you the trustee? Hey, come on. This is your job. Your job is to make gifts, not transfers.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're outsourcing everything else, which you should, by the way,
Yeah.
because somebody can do it better than you can do it. Well, then you get in, well, what is life enhancement? Somebody says, let's make it simple for a moment. It isn't support. Support is automatically a transfer. You're fulfilling basic obligation. I'm not suggesting a trust shouldn't pay rent and stuff. No, don't hear that. That's just support. The real question is the action between the trustee, the founder, whose funds are in question, and the beneficiary, does it enhance that beneficiary's life? That's the question the trustee must wrestle with. And I'll give a quick example because I know we won't have time for questions.
Yep.
Years and years ago, one of my mentors who didn't like it when I talked this way kept trying to find something that was support. So he called me up and he said, Jay, I've got you this time. I said, okay, okay, Dick, how you got me? He said, well, my niece, who's the beneficiary of this trust that I'm trustee of, has asked for someone to clean her house once a week. I said, that's got to be support. That can't be life enhancing. I said, really? Remember, this guy's a bachelor. He's 80 years old. What does he know? Not much. Okay. So I said, Dick, I said, does she have a husband? Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, some children? Yeah, 2 boys. Does she work? Yes. He said, oh, I don't like where this conversation's going. I said, well, how much time does she devote to her teaching? Oh, she's full time. And how much does she devote to her boys when they come home from school full time? And then what time does she have for her husband? Well, she complains about she doesn't have enough time for her husband. Really? So I said, let me ask you one simple question. When does she have 15 minutes by herself in silence for a cup of tea? He said, I'm sending the check. So the trustee really needs to be in the world of the person who they're seeking to enhance his or her life. Should we turn to questions? You're the facilitator.
Yes, I think we should open it up for questions. If you want to submit those questions in the chat, that's the easiest way. Other than that, I don't think I'll be able to see everyone if they're going to raise their hand. So submit your question in the chat, and then I'll call on you, and we'll have Jay speak to you. While the audience is doing that, Jay, I wanted to ask one more question.
Yeah.
That is a real challenge, and that is, gifts of operating companies and this tendency to want to give equally, even when there's kids in the business, working in the business, some kids not in the business. And there's this challenge of, kind of what hat am I wearing? Am I a parent or am I a business owner? And what's good for the family and what's good for the business? Can you talk a little bit about, just how to approach that? Not what the right answer is, because every family's a little different, but how do you approach that shared giving question when it comes to an operating company?
Well, Dave, our field, in my view, has not done a very good job of focusing on the fact that if you get one share, you become an owner. Our field has spent lots of times in the business schools on the enterprising programs on management, partly because founders of businesses are fascinated by management succession. They won't be there, and what's going to happen to my Ozymandian business.
Yeah.
You give someone one share, you're asking them to assume all of the strategic responsibilities of being an owner. Our field has done a very poor job, in my opinion, of preparing people for that one share, much less 20 shares or 30% or whatever it may be. You get one share of that business, you become a strategic owner of that business. So with that gift comes a very heavy responsibility of learning how to be a strategic thinker about that enterprise. I've said to people for years and years and years, don't spend any time on management succession. If you have a business that you want to transcend and transition to a second and third generation, their capacity to own that business is what matters, not who works in it. Work, it is a vocational calling. It's vocare, Dave. It's not labore. It's the great Latin vocatus, vocare, calling. Management is a calling. It's not something you get because you had some father did that or mother. No, it better be a calling because that's who you're competing with. The much more difficult question is that one share, how do I learn to become a great owner? Which is a strategic question, not tactical.
Yeah.
This has been a great problem in our field.
Jay, I'm going to take it to the Drucker School, and we're gonna be a part of the solution.
Good.
How to be an owner. Okay, we have some questions coming in, and I want to get to those. Let's go ahead and go to Jeff Arnold. Jeff, if you'd like to unmute your phone and ask your question, we'd love to have you join us.
Hi, Jay. Hi, Dave.
Hello.
I enjoyed in your book talking about, different strategic vehicles to gift, and the family bank being one of those. And so I'd like you to maybe provide an example of tying that successfully to this cycle, my word, virtuous cycle, right?
Yes.
To perpetuate.
My father came up with the idea of a family bank. I won't go into the story. It's in some of my writings. But Jeff, the key question he wanted my brother and sisters and I, as adults, to find out who each other was. Because after all, joint decision-making is everything, isn't it? But we don't necessarily know who we are as adults. Maybe we know each other as children, but we certainly often don't. So his idea was that in an institution that he and Mom funded, and then could have a veto, which they, of course, never exercised, that the responsibility of my brother and sisters and I was to receive requests for grants or loans, and then learn from each other what it is that inspired that request. And then how could we act? It wasn't the money or the project, it was the learning together to learn about each other and to be able to support each other. So family banks are not venture capital enterprises. That's fine. You want to have a venture capital fund, go put money and go do that. That's not a family bank. That's a venture capital enterprise. You want a family bank, it's about grants and loans within the family that encourage awareness of each other's aspirations. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you,
Thank
Jeff.
you.
Good question, Jeff.
Nice to meet you.
Aggie, I wanted to see if you wanted to join your voice to the call. You submitted your question early. Do you want to take yourself off of mute and ask your question?
Yes. Jay, I'm just a huge fan of yours. So
Nice to meet you.
Love everything that you do. My question was, a lot of people, and to your point, we have a lot of families that are really about the management of the business and our assets and owning. My question is, do you believe it's important to teach heirs? And if so, most importantly, about the stewardship for the short time we are on earth versus owning?
Absolutely. What I do think, Aggie, is that stewardship tends historically, and beneficence tends historically to be something that we get interested in the third stage of life. We get interested at about 60. The problem of teaching a 15-year-old is, to me, difficult because we're imposing 60 on a 15. So what I would say is that if we want stewardship to be natural, we must find metaphors that work for a 15-year-old, not that are requirements of a 60-year-old life. So stewardship is hugely important, but I think we have to be very careful that we're not saying it's a should, but rather that, because what we're really seeking is a natural interiority in that person to think, I'd like to help others. But stewardship itself is something historically that occurs later in life. So I'm not saying it can occur at all stages, but I think we have to be subtle. Does that make sense?
Totally. I love that.
Now, I will say in the business context that, coming back a little bit to sort of example, we'll use college as a great reveal. I think you can also, if you have a business enterprise, if you ask the young person to think about who are our customers, not who are our employees, not our product, who are our customers? How do we relate to them? What responsibility do we have to them? Who are they? What kind of people use our stuff? you get right to it, but you get to it at a place that that person can understand it.
Hmm.
Make
That helps.
sense?
Aggie, I'll add
Lovely to
one thing
meet you.
too. I think about it as fingerprints as well. Like, where would you like to have your fingerprints, in the organization? Maybe they can't understand stewardship, that's too big, but looking at it in terms of where do you want to have impact? Where can you add your unique talent to make the whole greater than it currently is? So I love that answer, Jay. Aggie, thanks for asking that question. I appreciate it.
Dave, can I do a follow-up? Because you just brought something out, and I'll make it quick. We have sometimes our families do internships, primarily to be exposed and with the employees as well. And then even trying to help them find their place in the world. The fingerprint thing I love, because that tells me that helps kind of maybe bring it all together a little bit in the way a child or a minor might receive some of that. Does that?
Yeah. And I would say too that when people are thinking about internships and they're aspiring and they have ideas, I think it's a great opportunity for families to introduce assessments. I'm not typing. I'm not getting into the old-fashioned typing. No, assessments are enormously useful all through life because they give us questions about, am I that or not? Am I like this or not like that? The strange thing, Aggie, to me is how many of my business entrepreneurial families wouldn't hire anybody today without assessment and can't imagine applying it at home. Wow. Why would we apply it to a stranger when we could so much apply it and help ourselves? Enough said.
Thank you. That was awesome.
The other thing I like to do, Aggie, is turn it on its head. So sometimes we put so much pressure on the senior generation to figure out where the rising generation is going to fit. I like to flip it on its head, especially for my college students, and say, you look at the business. You tell me where you can add unique value. You tell me the skills that you want to go get and bring back, because then when it's their idea, when they've discovered it on their own, they bring it back. They come with a lot more energy. They come with a lot more ownership of the idea and the concept. And so I think sometimes we put too much pressure on the senior generation to figure out what the path is for the rising generation. And I think we need to flip it sometimes so that they can own it when they come back. Anyways, enough
Love
said.
it.
I'm off
Love
my
it.
soapbox.
Next question.
Thank you.
All right. Mark Hartnett, would you please join us to ask your question? This may be the last one we can take.
Would love to. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Jay. On my desk back here, I've got about 40 transfers for a family that gets their valuation done every year, and it comes out usually late summer. And then I get a flurry of, I want to transfer just under the annual gifting amount. And it's literally about 25 recipients. And so most of these recipients are minors. Jay, a lot of these are 4, 5, 6-year-old.
Yeah.
What can a family do to instill some spirit in this when they don't want to have the conversation with a 6-year-old or even a 12-year-old? Because honestly, these 12-year-olds are millionaires and they don't want them to know the value in the trust or that they're even gifting. So what would you say to that?
Well, let's first say, are they prepared for the great reveal that cannot legally be avoided when that child is 18 or 21? That's my first question to them. Okay, you want for taxes to just give this just under the end. Do the math with me over 20 years, 21 years, whatever it may be. Are you prepared for that great reveal? Don't tell me it that when the kid's about to go to have the great reveal, oh my God, because that leads to remorse.
Yeah.
Remorse is the worst position for an advisor to find a client in. Oh my goodness. Why would we want to give advice to a client that we know is going to lead to remorse.
Yeah.
Wake up. Wake up. Let's
Mark,
think forward.
Mark, I have an idea for you. I would ask the client to fast forward life to when that child needs to know that, and what is their greatest hope when that information lands. And it will be a struggle for them to answer that, but they need to be asked that tough question.
And Dave, this comes all the way back to the question of the meteor that we began our conversation with. That set of gifts, every one of them is a meteor. Each one is an independent meteor. Think of the consistency of 20 years of meteors, or 25 into that child's life that he or she has no idea about. Isn't it going to be too big? So we say to the 23-year-old, find yourself, take a walkabout, be an intern, the great question we were asked. Discover yourself. Oh, and by the way, you don't need to work. What? Yeah, no, you don't need to work. Oh.
Yeah.
Really? Well, how about work? In some go help the anyway. You see what I'm saying? For heaven's sakes, we know the outcomes. Give the client the gift of no remorse.
And the beauty is, Mark, that we have the stories. When I was teaching at the University of Nebraska, I would Google my student's name just to kind of know who was coming, and also to see if there was anything on the internet that shouldn't be there about them. And we'd have these conversations. And at the beginning of the semester, I found that there was something that was very public, that it was a gift because the mother had made a gift and it was a public company. And that son was turning 21 during my semester, and it was not going to be comfortable. And so I went and visited with that mother, and I said, what does he know? What does he know? Because he's been exposed. It's out there. And she said she hadn't had a conversation with him about it. And so someone else was going to find out about it and tell him about this gift, this magnificent gift that had happened. Anyways, it's those types of stories that are kind of.
And Dave, this is the name. This is the name on the building at the college that the child goes to, chooses to go to, and walks down and finds his grandfather's name on the building. And the kid next to him said, "Is that you?" Oh dear! Whoa! How do I get a hole big enough that I can climb into? Okay. Yes. Do we have one more question, or no? Are we done?
I think our time is spent, but this has been fantastic. Mark, thank you for that question. Thank you all for investing your time with us today. Again, I would hope that you buy the book and read it. I mean, maybe many of you have already read it, but there's so much for you as an individual. And if you serve families, there's so much for you to consider in this book. Jay, thanks for being so generous with sharing your wisdom with us and your time. And until next time, my friend.
Dave, what a joy. Hugs to everybody. Hugs all around. Until soon.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Until soon.